All right, so we are now live. So thank you so much for everyone who is tuning in, or if people are watching this later on, thank you for taking the time to listen to what we have to say. Today we're going to be talking about our community conversation will be centered on the over-incarceration of the LGBTQIA plus community. Obviously, this is something that will come as no shock to anyone, but it's something that I feel like, especially in Oklahoma, we don't often take the time to dive into the data, to dive into the root causes, to really break it down. It's just an overstated fact. So we're hoping to be able to kind of parse that out, really get into the nitty gritty, the details today. So I'll start myself with introductions and then we'll go around to all of our panelists. I am new in this space, so my name is Ashley Bender. I am our interactive marketing manager, and I will be our new host for webinars moving forward. So I'm really happy to take over this space and get to chat with so many awesome panelists. And then Cindy, we can start with you if everyone would just introduce themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley. Hi, everybody. My name is Cindy Nguyen. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the policy director for the ACLU of Oklahoma.
I'm Michael Olson. I am the policy counsel for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform.
And I'm Aurelius Francisco. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm the co-executive director of Foundation for Liberating Minds.
Perfect. And we're so excited to have you guys here. As I was kind of chatting formally, and people will know this if they follow our pages or if you're finding us for the first time, this is a new space that OCGR is kind of being called to step into. There are so many powerful players in this space when it comes to advocating for the rights and righting so many of the historical wrongs that have happened to the LGBTQIA community, but this is a new space for us. So we're here to learn, we're here to kind of like grow in this space with everyone. So we think this is a great first step. So with that in mind, if we can just start off with some of the key factors that are contributing to this over-incarceration, that's even starting, what kind of led to it, this historical over-incarceration of this community.
Liz, do you want to go first? Because I feel like it's one of those questions where it's like, how much time do you have?
Right. Yeah, I could start and sort of get the ball rolling. Yeah, the sort of historical context for the overrepresentation of LGBTQ people in prisons and jails across the country, and specifically in Oklahoma, is really rooted in the policing and criminalization of the gender binary. And so dating back throughout the United States history, but particularly in the mid-20th century, we see a trend of the policing of the gender binary. And so people may have heard of driving while Black, the threat that Black people face just going to work or going to the grocery store, right, of potentially being pulled over and that potentially being a fatal interaction. There's also another saying that maybe people haven't heard of walking while trans, walking while transgender, which speaks to the reality that for people who are gender expansive, gender nonconforming, transgender individuals, there has been a long history of criminalizing their very identities, right? For a long time, cross-dressing, which is sort of dressing in a way that does not conform to someone's perceived gender identity. So a butch lesbian, for example, a woman dressing in masculine clothing was illegal, and people were policed and criminalized as a result of this, right? And so you have this policing of the gender binary, of the strict enforcement of male and female categories that renders really transgender people and gender nonconforming people as illegal, right? Their very identities as illegal. And so this criminalization and policing leads to them being incarcerated. You also have realities within the LGBTQ community because they are disproportionately impacted by homelessness and by trauma that results in a reliance and sometimes abuse of substance use and drug use. And we know throughout America's history, the war on drugs, the criminalization of drug use, in particular drugs, in particular communities, low-income communities of color, there are disproportionate rates of drug use within the LGBTQ community because of how much trauma queer and trans people are put under, right? And so this criminalization continues within the for queer and trans people specifically for drug use and drug criminalization. You also have the world of sex work. And so you have a lot of queer and trans people who are fleeing unsafe homes, of homes that are not safe for them to live in, and then are having to result in survival economies of stealing, right, of sex work, of drug use to survive. And all of these sort of actions are criminalized, right, are criminalized by the criminal legal system, then thus funneling young queer and trans people and queer and trans adults into the criminal legal system. And so those are a couple areas in sort of historical context that all deserve much deeper conversation, but I would start there.
Aurelius, I love that you touched base on all of those subjects because it is a number of things. And when we talk about key factors or quote unquote risk factors, we want to be clear that being trans isn't the risk factor, white supremacy is. That transphobia is the risk factor in and of itself. When I talk about what it means to be trans and all the things that come with that, I think of a pyramid, and at the very bottom of that pyramid is the dehumanization of trans and queer people, the dehumanization of really inflammatory language of calling queer folks groomers or sexualizing them, or kicking your child out of the house because you don't agree with them. All of these things can contribute to violence against the trans and gender nonconforming community because you no longer see them as human as you are. And because you no longer see them as human, it results in a denial of opportunities when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to housing, when it comes to access to bathrooms in public. We have seen multiple bills in the state legislature that target trans and gender nonconforming people's ability to simply exist in public. And we know that when you can no longer exist in public spaces, you are going to turn to other ways to support yourself. Aurelius talked about sex work, drug use to survive a lot of the trauma that comes with that. We know that 90% of trans people have faced employment discrimination. And I don't know about you, but if I came to the workplace every day and people weren't treating me the way that I would like to be treated, I'm not going to last there for very long. So we just wanted to reiterate that being trans in and of itself, and having to face transphobia and white supremacy in states like Oklahoma can be incredibly difficult to survive.
Yeah, I agree with what both of them said. We have there are obviously discrimination against LGBTQ individuals at every single level of the criminal justice system, and that obviously has the effect of increasing the incarceration rate amongst this population. So first, we have, as was talked about, we have discriminatory laws. Those are the laws like crimes against nature, anti-sodomy laws, transgender bathroom laws. And these are all either purposely or in their effect targeted specifically at LGBTQ populations. And you can also see that sort of discrimination at a more localized level when you're talking about policing and in the courtroom. So as was talked about, in everyday law enforcement, police frequently target these individuals for certain crimes, especially vice crimes, things like prostitution, lewd conduct, indecent exposure. For these types of crimes, police and prosecutors have a huge amount of discretion in determining whether and when to arrest and prosecute. And due to the improper use of this discretion, we see sex workers, transgender women, and LGBTQ youth are particularly punished. And that has a toxic effect on queer communities at every conceivable level. You have the marginalization and subsequent criminalization of these individuals, bias in the judicial system, trauma during incarceration in prisons and jails, and in disproportionate sentencing, particularly when you look at death penalty cases.
Right. It's really a holistic, and this is kind of what I was alluding to when we started, is we know that there's this over incarceration, but when you start to break it down, it makes sense how systemic it is, how historical it is, and how robust it is. The most, I think, heartbreaking part of working in criminal legal reform is when you see how many touch points it has, how one person's life can find a touch point with the criminal legal system in 20, 30 different ways, especially when you're a part of a community that is being targeted, it's like a very targeted attack. It just increases the likelihood that you have a touch point with the criminal legal system. So with that in mind, we're kind of getting a look at the holistic experience that these individuals have and how they could have a touch point with the criminal legal system. How are we seeing this touch point actually differ from heterosexual individuals to cisgendered counterparts? Because there is a big difference even with the actual touch point.
I think Michael alluded to this in his first answer, but the sort of routine violence within prisons and jails of sexual assault and sexual violence is pervasive for all people who are incarcerated. But it is a sort of exponential increase of harassment and of violence, sexual violence especially, that is geared towards LGBTQ people who are incarcerated, and particularly for transgender individuals. We can also think about this violence through, and I talked about earlier, the sort of enforcement of the gender binary. This enforcement is also enforced rigidly through men's and women's prisons, right? That there's only two types of prisons that we have, right? People are separated on lines of their sex, right? And so for gender expansive people, non-binary people, transgender people, you see the realities that trans women are placed into male facilities, that trans men are placed into women's facilities, right? And so this is also a form of violence, forcing people into gendered spaces that do not adhere to their own gender identity, and then put them up into an increased environment of threat to experience that violence and that harassment because of their gender identity. And then you also have in these facilities the sort of rampant lack of, if you can even call it, healthcare that is offered in these spaces. And for transgender individuals who are needing gender affirming healthcare, they are often denied this healthcare that really can be fatal for themselves, right? And so these are the sort of particular forms of violence that some transgender people are faced with in prisons and jails.
Aurelius, you made a fantastic point that even the prison system in and of itself, dividing between men and women, has no space for trans folks or gender expansive folks. We know when we look at the stats that trans and queer people are 5 times more likely to be assaulted by staff. When you think about how you have to become violent and hypermasculine to survive a really violent environment like a prison system, and you do not fit into those gender norms or those gender expectations of you, then you become a target, not only from staff, but from other people who are incarcerated. We know that 2S LGBTQ plus people are incarcerated at 3 times the general population. And then when you are experiencing all of these things and also experiencing violence within the prison system, it can be incredibly difficult to survive. I talk about what it means to be a 2S LGBTQ plus survivor of domestic violence who fights back, and then you end up in prison as well. We say not only are they facing abuse from their partner, but they are also facing abuse at the hands of the incarceration system as well.
Yeah, those are both excellent points. And I also want to point out that the only common solution that gets used in prisons nationwide is what's termed protective custody or administrative isolation in some cases. And basically what that means is that they're just put into segregation where they can't really interact with anyone else. And we know that that's not necessarily safer. It's just a lot more restrictive and often leads to a loss of privileges that are valued by inmates in general. And so the consistent use of isolation and solitary confinement to like help with this problem is not really a solution, and it's resulting in devastating psychological impacts that have also been documented in these cases. And I just want to reiterate what Cindy said at the beginning, that in this case, we are punishing these individuals because they're at more risk for prison violence. But at the end of the day, that risk is not their responsibility. It's not something that's coming from within themselves. It's coming from the incarceral system generally. And also, I want to point out that this violence isn't limited to prisons, but also when you look at violence against LGBTQ victims, law enforcement officers make up the third largest category of perpetrators in the country. So I read a recent report that focused on anti-LGBTQ violence, and many respondents reported they had experienced verbal abuse, physical abuse, and sexual violence perpetrated by police officers. So police officers account for 23% of all offenders who were unknown to the victim nationwide. So this isn't just a carceral problem, it's also a police violence problem.
Yeah, that's really important. I'm glad that you brought that up, Michael, around solitary confinement and the devastating psychological impacts, and then also around policing. I also just want to add, because I think when we're having these conversations from the mindset of working to reform or transform the system, there are some responses to some of these issues that are particular and disproportionate impact to the LGBTQ community, to reformulate the system in a way that doesn't address the root causes of the problem. And so, for instance, there are some liberal reforms for prisons that, or models, right, that are looking to create gender expansive prisons, right? Prisons that are specifically sort of created for gender nonconforming or transgender individuals, right? And I just want to speak to the reality that the violence of prisons, the sexual violence, the sexual assault, both between incarcerated people and staff, right, prison guards, and administrators within these prison facilities, is inherent to carcerality, is inherent to the prison and the jail, right? And so creating a gender expansive jail, or we've seen in New York, a feminist jail for incarcerated women, isn't the solution that we think it is, because prisons, as they are created, are meant to be violent places, right? They're meant to instoke and invoke fear and violence in people, and create that really hyper masculine, as Cindy talked about, experience for folks. And so I just wanted to add that, because I think that is something that we hear some about as a potential solution or reform that really wouldn't have the changes that are necessary.
Right. And I think even just to contextualize for people, when we're talking about this violence, from between 2016 and 2019, just Oklahoma County Jail had, I think it was like just under a 4.8 per 1,000 mortality rate, while the national average at that time was like 1.4, 1.5. So if we're just looking at the baseline of violence that we're seeing, and we're not even looking at targeted communities that are actually even being gone after on top of that, if you just take the baseline of violence that you're seeing in these facilities and then dive deeper into, hearing these 90%, a lot of the data Mike and I were looking at is, 75+% of XYZ. Most of the time you're looking at the statistics of how this community is impacted. It is significant when it comes to the percentages of individuals who are affected in facilities that are already so violent, with already so many impacted individuals. So that is so important, just to note how much it is happening. And so additionally, we've kind of talked about that during. If we could just briefly touch on the after incarceration. We know that formerly incarcerated individuals, again, already by nature of the tag that people have slapped on them, have a harder time reintegrating into society. But can we talk about how this community has, an extra tag, an extra barrier, and what that extra barrier actually looks like for the LGBTQIA community when they are returning as a returning citizen after a period of incarceration?
Yeah, I'm happy to touch base on that subject. And like I said at the very beginning, there's that denial of opportunities after the dehumanization. We saw a stat that said that trans people are 4 times more likely to live in a household income of less than $10,000. So I don't know about y'all, but I cannot exist on that type of income. And if you are being discriminated at work, if you are not able to get the healthcare that you need, it can be incredibly difficult to be able to maintain employment in corporate workplaces or any workplaces that do not embrace your full self. So we do see individuals going into things like sex work or other things just to survive in this type of economy. And because of this, we often see people facing and experiencing homelessness when you are also being discriminated against when you are trying to get housing, when you are trying to rent. In Boston, trans people are 61% more likely to be denied rental units overall. And that's in a place like Boston, not in Oklahoma. So when you are facing discrimination at every single level, of course, you are going to encounter the criminal legal system, whether that is at school, on the streets, or other places. You are more likely to experience that because you are pushed out of a lot of spaces and you can't exist in public.
Yeah, I think Cindy really hit on all of the points, and I would just sort of add that when we talk about sort of the disproportionate impact that 2S LGBTQ people have as it relates to the entire spectrum of the criminal legal system, from interaction with the police to the courts to actually being incarcerated to reentry into society, just want to hit on the reality that for even people who are not discriminated against as a result of their identities, their racial, gender, sexuality identities, right? When you are getting out of prison, it is incredibly, incredibly difficult, right? To go back into society and to try to be, sorry, I was getting a call. To try to be a productive citizen, right? To try to, like Cindy said, get housing, to get a well-paying job, right? To have access to food, so on and so forth, right? And so when you are a person who is discriminated against as a result of your race, as a result of your gender identity, as a result of your sexuality, right? For Black and Latinx, queer people, right? For Black trans women, these realities are increased that much more. It is that much more difficult. So you already have this label of criminal or of formerly incarcerated person or a felon on you, right? In addition to the labels and the discrimination that people are faced with simply as a result of their identity, right? And so when we think about like some of the healthcare bans that have been recently implemented, bathroom bans that have been implemented, that have made it hard for trans people and queer people more generally to just exist in Oklahoma, it is that much more difficult for people who then have the added barrier and added hurdle of having been criminalized and incarcerated.
Yeah, we have a reentry guide here at Oklahoma's for Criminal Justice Reform that attempts to even start to help with that process. But what we found when looking through all of the needed resources is that it's endless. You know, you come out of the carceral system with nothing. You have no money, so you need a job. Okay, to get a job, you need a driver's license. Okay, to get a driver's license, you might need documents that you no longer have, maybe a birth certificate, something to do that. So then you're going to office after office. Many people do not have transportation. Our public system, our public transit system here in Oklahoma, we know is not robust. It is also money. How are you going to pay for that public transit system if you do not have money? You cannot make money. It's just one thing after the other. You know, you might need a food bank, you might need a clothing bank, you might need addiction treatment or some sort of treatment services. How do you even begin to look at all this? Do you have a phone that you can just start calling in the digital age that we live in? You can't just, show up places. You can't just find things in a paper. It all just becomes one on top of the other, the stacking. And we really work deeply in this reentry space, but I can't echo enough what you said of how difficult it truly is for anyone to re-enter society after a period of incarceration. They need innumerable resources that many of them just don't have that system in place, and Oklahoma has not put that system in place for them either. And I would like to briefly touch on what Cindy kind of said, that at school part. We know from the work that we do that the school to prison pipeline is affecting various youth, but it's disproportionately affecting individuals who are, again, targeted communities. So it's disproportionately impacting LGBTQIA youth, especially in terms of incarceration rate. But I'd like to just talk about how generally and more specifically the school to prison pipeline is affecting the youth of this community.
Once again, I think we could talk about this one for days. I know Aurelius and I definitely can. But there are a number of things, including the increase of school resource officers and just introducing the criminal legal system early on. We know that just by their very presence, that violence against students increase, as well as infractions and referring people to the juvenile justice system overall. That many queer students who do not adhere to the gender expectations of their gender presentation are more subject to bullying. And when they are subject to bullying, sometimes you fight back to defend yourself. And this can look like another infraction. In fact, a lot of these things that when we see students quote unquote acting out when it comes to truancy, drug use, alcohol use, or simply just talking back to a teacher are just signs of PTSD and trauma. And that when we are not addressing that head on, that the cycle is going to continue. If you are a queer youth and you don't have a safe space at home or at school, chances are you may be more likely to act out. We know that 40% of 2S LGBTQ plus youth, or 40% of youth who are homeless are also 2S LGBTQ plus. So we know that those numbers are astronomical, that oftentimes that queer youth are the ones that face the brunt of a lot of the criminal legal systems, that when they are experiencing homelessness, when they are fighting to protect themselves, when they go to a school that is not a safe space for them, when they don't see teachers that look like them, they are more likely to interact with the criminal legal system.
And that also goes to the reentry part earlier as well, that as Cindy was just saying, there's in a lot of these cases, there's not a lot of familial support. And that is a key part to reentry, is having familial support. So that's another reentry problem. But also, as she just said, the homelessness problem is also a huge problem. And I also want to point out that there's absolutely no evidence that non-heterosexual youth engage in greater illegal behaviors. So, but they do get punished more. So that's the crux of the problem, is that there's definitely not any evidence that there's heightened criminality within this group, but they are being treated as if there is. And I think that is one of the main problems, because when you start them with criminal justice contact as a youth, they're more likely to experience more of it as an adult. And that's part of what's driving this over-incarceration problem.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, Michael. It is the targeting by school resource officers, by law enforcement officers, by the juvenile justice system. It isn't individual behaviors or actions or a higher propensity to be or to engage in criminal acts, but it is really LGBTQ youth who are trying to survive in a really rough environment and space here in the state of Oklahoma, who are having to engage in certain actions and trying to literally survive, right, while trying to still attend school and, be a kid, right, and are faced with all of these various barriers of their identity isn't affirmed in the classroom, they can't use the bathroom that adheres to the gender identity, so on and so forth. Maybe they don't have an affirming home, right? Then makes it that much more likely for them to act out, right? For them to get upset or get angry, right? To deal with mental health issues, right? And I think just more broadly speaking, the issue of the school to prison pipeline in Oklahoma is an issue of our priorities in the state. And so when we talk about just the sheer amount of money that it costs to incarcerate a human being, whether in a juvenile justice system or in an adult carceral facility, the numbers are astronomical, right? We know that Oklahoma is the third worst incarcerator in the entire world per capita, right? And the reality is that Oklahoma is also one of the worst educators in the entire country, right? And this is because of where our priorities are. Our priorities are more focused on criminalization and incarceration to solve the problems of homelessness or solve the problems of substance misuse, right? Rather than pouring money into resources for our communities, right? And so the sort of turn or pivot needs to be on focusing on increasing funding and capacity within our education system that works to provide resources and care through social workers and counselors in schools, through teachers who are, one, better paid, and two, have some professional development around allyship and advocacy and affirmation for the LGBTQ community. And then also, removing school resource officers. There's no reason that in an educational facility, there needs to be police officers who are simply there, right, to police and surveil young people, to police and surveil students, right? And we also know that like rates of the juvenile justice system, right, LGBTQ youth are starkly disproportionately represented within the juvenile justice system. In the general population, LGBTQ youth make up about 9.5% of people in the US, right? But in the juvenile justice system, LGBTQ youth represent 20% of people in the system, right? And as Michael said, that is not a result of LGBTQ youth being any more criminal than non-LGBTQ youth, but it is about the circumstances that these young people are in and the reality that they don't have the resources and the care that they need. And in lieu of those resources and care is the juvenile justice system and more punishment.
Right. I think it's interesting too, as we speak about this space, there's so many other spaces that have a lot of data, have a lot of really robust conversations going on that could be mimicked to this community, but that data is not there. Like when we talk about ACE scores, when we talk about how we know certain children are impacted, if they have a high ACE score, they are more likely to have a touch point with the criminal legal system. But that data that shows the touch points that are increasing the ACE scores for these youth is not there. A lot of this, the things that could make this conversation so much easier, so much more palatable, so to speak, is just not there. But we've heard it all the time in different fonts. Same thing recently, we were talking on our podcast about poverty, how poverty changes how children grow up. It affects their memory. They often have memory issues. They often have decision-making issues, long-term planning issues, and that's not their fault. That's by nature of being in this fight or flight their whole life. We can see that in other populations. We can start to rationalize that, the root causes of that. But those conversations, I feel, are so lacking for this community. While we can, like Cindy has been saying, we can humanize these issues for other people, it seems, especially in Oklahoma, we lack the ability to humanize these issues for this community, and they need it more starkly than any other community. The reform has to happen, but there are communities that are being torn apart inside and out by the carceral system and by the criminal legal system. So I appreciate all of the insights that you guys have said, and I think where we have started in this space with OCJR, it's just shocking how much of the conversation is hard to find. It's so difficult. You have to dig and dig to find what you already know you're going to find, what you already know is there. So after that really happy, upbeat part, we're going to switch a little. We're going to try to look at solutions. We're going to try to look at next steps. I feel like we've done a good job of giving kind of the lay of the land for a lot of people, of the historical context, as well as what we're seeing now across the nation and in Oklahoma when it comes to this over-incarceration. So now, if we can kind of look towards both legislative solutions, I know they're more sparse here in Oklahoma than nationwide, so feel free to kind of open up if you do have hopes of where Oklahoma could move, whether the solutions be legislative or whether the solutions be more community centric. I'd love for us to be able to chat about that.
Yeah, and I think people that are here on this panel and watching this probably know that we do a lot of defensive work in the state legislature, that it's really difficult to introduce any type of proactive bill when it comes to the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And when they are introduced, they don't get heard in committee. So Representative Maury Turner introduced a bill that would have decriminalized having HIV in and of itself, which you say that to a lot of people and they can't believe that we are criminalizing just having HIV, that it is still in our books that it can be a felony up to 5 years if you don't disclose your status, or if they assume that you are engaging in sex work because or engaging in sex work and have HIV. So normally HIV, that status is protected federally, but once somebody is accused of spreading HIV on purpose, then that becomes public record when you have to go through the court system, when you get your mugshot taken. Even if somebody is just accusing you of having that, and you don't have to go through the system, you're acquitted, or all the charges are dropped, your mugshot is still out there when you apply for jobs, and people can still be biased against that. It can be nearly impossible to wipe that off a website. We've had laws that target loitering, and many people may not think that this relates to anything to do with 2S LGBTQ plus folks, but when you think of the recent protests because people's rights are being taken away, the targeting of trans people, we know that there can be a direct attack on those communities. When we just saw a bill that added $50 million to public schools in Oklahoma to increase school resource officers and school safety, we know that also attacks queer and trans youth. So not only is it the attacks on healthcare, the attacks on public access to restrooms, it is all of the criminal legal bills, because we know that queer and trans folks are more likely to interact with that system.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Cindy really is the expert legislatively. And so I would just ditto on all of that. I'm a community organizer, right? And so I think a lot about in my work and doing, the work to engage with community building. And I think so much of what is needed is solidarity across communities, and the understanding that no one is going to save us, right? That we have systems in place that are targeting our communities, and particularly the intersections of communities between communities of color and LGBTQ communities, right? Immigrant communities, disabled communities, right? That are again, not siloed or sparsed out communities, but are individuals and communities that exist all at once, right? And to also understand that, I think so much of what you were talking about earlier, Ashley, around like that some of this work is hard to find, especially in Oklahoma, like that is clearly connecting the dots between the criminal legal system and all of the problems of Oklahoma's incarceration crisis and policing and prosecutorial misconduct and so on and so forth. Its specific impacts and disproportionate impacts on the LGBTQ community, I think is twofold. I think it's both because in the criminal justice space, right, rightfully so, the criminal justice system and problems within it have been seen as an issue that impacts low-income communities and especially communities of color, Black and Brown, Indigenous communities, Asian American communities, right? And there is sort of, I think, in people who are engaged, advocates and organizers, policymakers especially, there is a lack of a sort of intersectional analysis on how all of those communities also encompass, right, the LGBTQ community, right? And then on the other hand, right, you also have a long history within the LGBTQ movement for rights for the LGBTQ community, for protections, for safety, for lived equality, as Freedom Oklahoma talks about it, right? In the mainstream movement for liberation for the LGBTQ community, it really has, right, historically centered cisgender, gay, and lesbian white people, right? And so we know who this will consistently leave out is the people who are most victimized, right, by the criminal legal system, right? So for Black and Brown LGBTQ people, for queer and trans immigrants, right? And so I think in both of these realms, both for advocates and organizers and policymakers within the criminal justice system, and for members of the 2S LGBTQ community and advocates who are, solely focused, right, on 2S LGBTQ liberation, there is a need to sort of combine and bring about a vision and a strategy that bridges the divide, right, between these battles, and that understands that they are one and the same, right? That a push against patriarchal, white supremacist, heteronormative systems and structures, right, is a push against, right, and for the transformation of the criminal legal system, that these fights are one and the same. And so I think there's a need for further political education and politicizing around these fights and these struggles to show the ways, right, that this work, that pushing for criminal legal system transformation really is an LGBTQ issue.
And from my perspective as a lawyer, I want to focus on what's going on in the courtroom for this answer. I read a study in California that 38% of gay and lesbian respondents felt threatened by the courtroom setting because of their sexual orientation or gender expression. And that study found that 1 out of 5 court employees heard a derogatory term about gays and lesbians in open court. And those comments were most frequently made by judges, lawyers, or other court employees. And so another statewide study in Arizona found that 77% of judges and attorneys reported that they heard disparaging comments about gays and lesbians, and 47% of those heard those in open court. So the problem is there's not really any restrictions, no explicit restrictions on what personal information can be introduced about a defendant's sexuality or their gender expression. And rules against any statements that might inflame a jury are not necessarily always enforced, especially when it comes to people that have queer identities. So I think one of the main problems that we see is that these individuals are not being represented adequately in court, and instead are being felt threatened by their courtroom experience. And I think that is a huge problem, because we can see that 40% of women on death row are either lesbians or have had their sexual orientation used as a factor against them during criminal sentencing. And so what they're doing is they're taking gender nonconforming identity or queer identity, and they're using that as a proxy for aggressiveness and criminality, especially when it comes to women on death row. And that's something that should not be legal, honestly, constitutionally. So it's something that we can see in the courtroom that I think really needs to be changed. How that process goes about, I'm not sure, but
Yeah, I think that all kind of sums up, again, how robust this issue is, which is horrible in and of itself. And I also was thinking, when we're talking about kind of the community aspect, while it may not always feel like it, the community of Oklahoma is palatable to change. We saw that through 780, we saw that through 781. While 781 has lacked its full breadth that should be utilized, this legislative session, we were able to finally get some form of funding starting to move towards it. And while I'm not completely overly hopeful that that funding will find this community quickly, I am hopeful that it will find this community eventually. And at least we can take that nugget of, they voted for 781. They voted for an increase in addiction treatment and mental health treatment. And this population we know needs those resources. Oklahomans need that resource. And that initiative additionally became more popular over time, regardless of it not even being fully implemented, not even being fully successful yet. it still has become more palatable to people. People are still wanting it. And so I think we can hold on to that nugget of your community members are probably more supportive than you might think off of the bat. And I do think we all truly are closer to fighting the same fight than we know. And I do think that education point is truly so important as well. Everything we just discussed was, and I really find that education and more people stepping into this space saying, hey, let me lift you up. Let me be a part of this space with you. Share it. Of course, we always want to center it around the community that's affected. We always want to have their voices top of line, but it's nice for them to have robust backup to finally get someone to listen. So I do think hopefully that's a bit of hope. And I'd like to center in a little bit more of that hope in what organizations and what support we see in Oklahoma when it comes to reentry, reducing recidivism rates, and just communities and organizations that are working. If you are a member of the LGBTQIA community, whether you're formerly incarcerated or whether you are incarcerated and you find yourself watching this webinar, what kind of resources does Oklahoma have? What kind of communities are we building that we can add on and people can get involved in, volunteer for, that they can find a place in?
Ashley, I think this touches base on what you talked about, where if you aren't getting the data that you need, then resources aren't going to be funneled into that area. If you're not being counted, then people don't know that you exist in our state. Often people ask the question of like, well, how many like trans people are actually in Oklahoma? And I always tell them that if you exist in a very hostile state that has consistently tried to take away your rights, are you going to truthfully answer any survey asking about your identity? And the answer is likely going to be no. But we do know that there are a handful of organizations that we encourage people to reach out to. And first and foremost, of course, the ACLU of Oklahoma. If you are a student or a family member, or you know somebody in public school who is being denied access to school bathrooms based on gender identity, or you've had an experience with a school resource officer, please reach out to us. Our emails are all over our website, so please do that. We also know Freedom Oklahoma. They have incredible resources, including support groups, especially for queer youth, parents, and teachers who are identity affirming and want to learn a little bit more about being an ally, or just hearing other people going through the same experience can be really healing. And then lastly, the one that I wanted to lift up is SISU Youth Services. We love them. They are an identity affirming shelter for youth 15 to 22. So those are just some of the resources. We can always use more in our state.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some great resources and organizations doing amazing work. I would add Dream Action Oklahoma, which is a immigrant rights org who does work all across the state and is a queer and youth-led organization, right? So they're working specifically at the intersection of immigration across communities and the deportation pipeline, right? And particularly its impacts on the LGBTQ community and the sort of immigrant community more largely. They do some amazing work to build communities and provide resources for immigrant populations across the state of Oklahoma. So that's another organization. And then I would also add Black Lives Matter Oklahoma City, which is a community organizing group, an organization that really is doing that work that I talked about earlier that is needed, of solidarity across communities, understanding that our oppression is linked and thus our freedom is linked. So they're doing quite a lot of work, specifically bridging the sort of gap and providing a bridge for Black, queer, and trans people, and queer and trans people of color more generally speaking. And they do quite a lot of reentry work in Oklahoma prisons and carceral facilities as well, for different religious groups and different identity groups across the state. And so that's another org who's doing some really, really amazing work.
That's perfect. I know that a lot of these community members can feel alone, especially when you might be looking at kind of how robust the system is by yourself. If you might be having that touch point and having to rationalize every part of your life that is criminalized, I know that that can be really, really daunting. So it's nice to know and uplift, give that free PR to these groups that are doing such great work. And I also would encourage, even if you don't fit in this community that we're talking about, even if you are not a member of the LGBTQIA community and you want to learn, that is so appreciated in all of those groups. Every single one that they said is willing to sit with you and teach you. And I have heard just in some of our conversations we've had that the language can be daunting to some people. They're like anti kind of incorporating this language into their life because they don't understand it. They don't want to misuse it. They don't want to be embarrassed. And so I would really, really like to say that education is so important, and just at the baseline of learning the appropriate use of pronouns, the appropriate use of vocabulary can be really empowering, and it can add that humanization to this issue that we're thinking of and we're talking about. Just truly anyone can reach out to any of these groups and they are happy to send resources your way. You can just follow them on social media, learn at your own pace, but begin to parse out this issue step by step. When we tell people to get involved in criminal legal reform, what we tell them is pick what matters to you. So if fines and fees is what matters to you, start in that space and then dive deeper. Okay, how does that affect my identity? How does that affect the identity of those around me? How does that affect the carceral system? And then you can move, and fortunately you will easily move from aspect to aspect of the criminal legal system and how that all interplays with each other. But I really would just so strongly encourage people to reach out to them with questions and don't feel that it's like daunting or that you'll be judged or that it's scary. They are all so kind. All of those groups are doing such good work, and they are happy to have additional people in the ring to help in this fight. So with that, I will move to final thoughts. Everyone has kind of a few minutes to summarize maybe anything that we didn't touch on quite robustly that you'd like to kind of point people to as well, or just kind of summation of what we chatted about today and any last thoughts that you'd like to leave our viewers with.
I can start here. Yeah, I appreciate this space and this conversation, and I'm really glad that OCJR is getting into it. Sort of specific conversations in this realm. I want to make a specific pitch and call to potential and allies, people who are cisgender, people who are heterosexual, and people whose gender performance isn't policed. That there is a need to, as you were just talking about, educate ourselves, but also that there is a need to take action for the LGBTQ community, right? The attacks against queer and trans people, and especially trans people in the state of Oklahoma, are rampant right now. And this isn't a time to sit on the sidelines to say that this doesn't impact you, because it does, right? Attacks on gender-affirming healthcare are attacks on everyone's bodily autonomy, right? Attacks on who can use the bathroom are attacks on all of us, right? Attacks on book bans and banning certain books that talk about gender identity and families with two moms and things of that nature are attacks on all of us, because it is education that also impacts all other communities, right? And so there really is a need for us to educate ourselves and to get involved in the fight by listening first and foremost, and then taking action in the way that is most helpful and most useful for the LGBTQ community, and to understand these intersections, right? That whatever your identities, whatever your passions, whatever your interest within this work, there is a very strong tie and intersection to the freedom and the liberation and the end of discrimination and attack and hate against the 2S LGBTQ community. And so I do want to just make that specific call, and also say that Foundation for Liberating Minds is here for that work, right? That really is what we're interested in, is providing that political education and providing that crucial sort of sharpening of analysis for people around systems of oppression and around the criminal legal system specifically, and how we can, sort of expand and more robustly address the problems within the system through root cause analysis. And so I want to say that we're here as well as a resource and a space of affirmation and care for our 2S LGBTQ brothers and sisters and siblings. So just appreciate this space for sure.
And I would love to just ditto everything that Relia said, and that if you're looking for a place to donate, that Foundation for Liberating Minds is the one that I will always recommend people to, because I continue to learn from those type of spaces. It challenges me. Ashley was talking about how it can be difficult language all the time, and the language is always changing, that I didn't start out knowing every single thing, that it took spaces provided, Foundation for Liberating Minds, spaces from other organizations dedicated to this work, calling me in and introducing language to me, to be able to really have these courageous conversations. So if you are scared to dive into the work, I promise we are not scary people. Please just reach out to us. And like Aurelia said, now is not the time to sit on the sidelines. It is really time to get involved and watch what is happening, especially in the court and state legislatures.
And I just want to thank Cindy and Aurelius for being here and giving their perspectives, which are obviously they know a lot about this issue. So it's important to learn from them, because we're just stepping into this. It's a natural progression from where we've been. We're obviously for justice for everyone, so that means everyone, and that's something that OCJR is committed to doing. But because I'm new to this space, I want to kind of use my final thoughts to just talk more generally about how in Oklahoma we have a dichotomy between victims and perpetrators, and it's just never that simple. It's not black and white where there's victims and there's perpetrators. There are, for instance, LGBTQ perpetrators that have been victims their entire life, as we've discussed, from both state-sponsored violence, other citizen violence, and just oppression in general. And so when people claim that they care about victims, but then don't embrace people that are victims when they commit a crime, I think is one of the biggest things we need to get over as a state, and that would have a large impact in this space particularly.
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what Mike said. Thank you so much for being willing to educate us, to step into this space with us and allow us to use our previous expertise and where we've been working for a while and learn and grow into this space and help making those connections and helping to move our resources into this space as well. Just really to drill in what Mike said, we are committed to working towards a more equitable Oklahoma, a more fair Oklahoma, and that truly is for every single Oklahoman. And truly, we all are so impacted by the carceral system. If you want to look at it financially, even if you aren't a part of the criminal legal system, you financially had part of that burden. And we could go on and on and on about how every single Oklahoman is responsible for this system. You are upholding this system in the way you vote or in your taxes and this and that. And so it is important that we all are on the same lines, and we hope that we have started a space in Oklahoma in which we can continue this conversation. We can continue to lift each other up and continue to say, as we are, I'm not the expert on this. I agree with you, but let me pivot you to someone who knows more than me. And that's really powerful in this space too. It's okay to say, I don't know the answer for you, but I know someone who knows the answer for you. So let's all work towards that solution together, learn from each other, and uplift each other. So I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for giving your time. Thank you to all of our viewers, and truly reach out to those groups that we all talked about. Learn, educate, and use the last bit of Pride Month that we have, as well as the rest of summer and every day after, to learn about the issues that your fellow community members, your neighbors, your teachers, your children in the community are dealing with, and work towards that humanization for everyone. So thank you all.